There are moments in geopolitics when a single action doesn't just trigger a response. It opens a door that had been closed for years, a door that everyone knew existed but no one wanted to touch. A door that once opened reveals options so dangerous, so complex, so unpredictable that even the most seasoned strategists begin to hesitate. This may be one of those moments. Because when a regional power acts boldly in a contested environment, especially one layered with competing interests, overlapping militaries, and fragile understandings, the consequences rarely stay local. They ripple outward. They touch actors who were not directly involved. They activate calculations that were sitting dormant. They force decisions that had been postponed indefinitely. And suddenly, a situation that seemed contained begins expanding in ways no one publicly prepared for. That is what makes this moment feel different. Not just the action itself, but where it happened. Because geography in geopolitics is never neutral. Some places carry weight far beyond their borders. They are not just locations, they are signals. They are lines of influence. They are zones where multiple powers operate under an unspoken balance, an understanding that everyone pushes, but no one pushes too far, until someone does. And when that happens, the reaction is not just about the event, it's about the precedent. Because if one actor demonstrates that the boundary can be crossed, then others must decide whether to accept that new reality, or push back in ways that reassert their own influence. And that is where the situation becomes far more dangerous than it appears on the surface. Because the immediate reaction everyone watches, the statements, the alerts, the visible military adjustments, is only part of the story. The real story unfolds behind the scenes, in secure rooms, in encrypted communications, in strategic frameworks that rarely reach the public. Because while headlines focus on what just happened, major powers focus on something else entirely. What options does this create? What opportunities does this open? What risks must now be addressed before they spiral out of control? And for one particular leader, those questions may carry more weight than anyone realizes. Because for years, Russia has operated within a carefully managed framework across multiple regions, balancing direct involvement with strategic restraint, maintaining presence without triggering uncontrollable escalation, projecting power without overextending. That balance is delicate. It depends on predictability. It depends on actors respecting certain informal limits. It depends on crises being managed rather than expanded. But when those limits are tested, when actions occur in areas where multiple powers maintain overlapping interests, the balance begins to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly. And in geopolitics, subtle shifts often matter more than visible ones, because they change the underlying assumptions guiding every future decision. If one actor feels its space has been challenged, it begins reassessing. If it believes its credibility is at risk, it begins recalibrating. If it sees an opportunity to strengthen its position without direct confrontation, it begins exploring options that were previously unnecessary. And those options are rarely discussed openly, because they don't involve immediate action. They involve positioning, preparation, influence, leverage. They involve shaping the environment so that when the next crisis comes, and it always does, the balance favors you. That is where strategic patience becomes power. Because not every response needs to be immediate to be effective. In fact, the most powerful responses are often delayed, calculated, delivered in ways that shift dynamics without triggering instant retaliation. That is the kind of thinking that defines long-term strategy. And it is exactly the kind of thinking that becomes relevant when boundaries are tested. Because from Moscow's perspective, the question is not simply what just happened, it is what this moment allows. What doors are now open that were previously closed? What moves are now justifiable that were previously too risky? What signals can now be sent without appearing as escalation, but rather as response? And those signals can take many forms. They do not need to be direct. They do not need to be loud. They do not need to be immediate. They can be economic, military, diplomatic, technological, informational. They can be designed to influence outcomes without firing a single shot. That is the essence of modern power competition. Because direct confrontation between major powers carries enormous risk.
But indirect influence, applied carefully, strategically, over time, can achieve similar outcomes without crossing dangerous thresholds. That is why this moment matters, because it may have created a space where new forms of influence become possible, where relationships can be deepened, where leverage can be expanded, where positioning can be improved quietly, without triggering the kind of escalation that forces immediate global reaction. And that is often where the real game is played, not in the headlines, but in the margins. Because while the world watches for dramatic moves, the most important changes often happen quietly. Trade agreements shift, military cooperation evolves, intelligence sharing adjusts, diplomatic language changes tone, new understandings emerge behind closed doors, and over time those small changes accumulate into something much larger. A reconfiguration of influence, a reshaping of alignment, a subtle but significant shift in who holds leverage in future crises. That is the long game, and it is the game that matters most. Because wars, conflicts, and crises are temporary. But the structures they create can last for decades. That is why major powers rarely waste moments like this. They study them. They analyze them. They use them to justify moves that would otherwise be difficult to explain. And they do it in ways that appear reactive, but are actually deeply strategic. That is what makes the current situation so complex. Because it is not just about one action. It is about the cascade of possibilities that follow. The chain reaction of strategic thinking that unfolds behind the scenes. The recalculations happening simultaneously across multiple capitals. Each actor asking the same fundamental question. What does this mean for us? And more importantly, what can we do now that we couldn't do before? Because every crisis creates constraints. But it also creates opportunities, opportunities to expand influence, to test boundaries, to reshape narratives, to strengthen positions. And the actors who recognize those opportunities early often gain the most. Not because they act first, but because they act smart, because they choose their moments, because they understand that power is not just about action, it is about timing. And timing is everything in moments like this. Act too quickly, and you escalate unnecessarily. Wait too long, and you lose the advantage. But move at exactly the right moment, and you can shift the entire balance without triggering a direct confrontation. That is the art of strategy. And it is the art being practiced right now, whether the public sees it or not. Because while the headlines focus on immediate tension, the deeper reality is unfolding quietly. Options are being evaluated. Scenarios are being modeled. Responses are being prepared, not necessarily for today, but for the next phase. Because every experienced strategist knows that the first move is rarely the decisive one. It is the response to the response that shapes the outcome. And that is where things become unpredictable. Because once multiple actors begin responding to each other's adjustments, the system becomes fluid, dynamic, difficult to control. That is when miscalculations become more likely, when signals are misread, when intentions are misunderstood, and when small actions can produce outsized consequences. That is the danger inherent in moments like this. Not just what has happened, but what might happen next. Because the more actors involved, the more complex the interaction becomes. Each decision influences another. Each response triggers another reaction. And over time, the situation evolves beyond the control of any single player. That is why restraint becomes as important as strength. Because knowing when not to act is often more powerful than acting immediately. But restraint requires confidence. Confidence that your position is secure. Confidence that you can afford to wait. Confidence that your options will still be available when you need them. And that is not something every actor has. Some feel pressure to act quickly, to demonstrate resolve, to send signals of strength. Others prefer to wait, to observe, to let the situation develop further before committing. And that difference in approach creates tension. Because when one side moves quickly and another moves slowly, the interaction becomes uneven, unpredictable, potentially volatile. That is the balance now being tested. Because if one actor believes it has created an advantage, it may push further. If another believes its position is being challenged, it may respond more forcefully. And suddenly, the situation escalates not because anyone intended it, but because each side is reacting to perceived changes in the balance. That is how crises grow, not through a single decision, but through a series of interconnected reactions, each one logical on its own, but collectively leading somewhere dangerous. That is why understanding the broader context matters, because without it, individual actions seem isolated, but in reality they are part of a much larger strategic picture. A picture where every move influences the next, where every signal carries meaning, where every decision shapes future possibilities. And in that picture, the most important question is not what just happened, but what happens next. Because that is where the true consequences will be determined. Not in the initial action, but in the chain of responses that follow. And that chain is only just beginning. Because when boundaries are tested in contested environments, the effects do not fade quickly. They linger. They influence future decisions. They reshape expectations. They alter the strategic landscape in ways that may not be immediately visible, but become undeniable over time. That is the nature of moments like this. They are not endpoints, they are turning points. Points where the trajectory of events begins to shift, where the future starts to diverge from the past, and where the decisions made in the coming days, weeks, and months will determine how far that shift goes. Because once the door is opened, it cannot simply be closed again. The options revealed by that opening remain. The possibilities created by that moment persist, and the actors involved must decide how to navigate them. Carefully, strategically, with an awareness that every move now carries more weight than before. Because the balance has changed, even if only slightly, even if only temporarily, even if only in perception. And in geopolitics, perception often becomes reality. That is why this moment matters. Not because it guarantees a specific outcome, but because it expands the range of possible outcomes. And among those possibilities are paths that lead to stability and paths that lead to escalation. Which path is taken will depend not on a single decision, but on many decisions made by many actors, each responding to the others. That is the complexity of the situation, and it is what makes it so difficult to predict, because no one controls the entire system. Each player controls only their own actions and must react to the actions of others. That is what creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is the most dangerous element of all, because it forces decisions to be made without complete information, under pressure, with limited time, and high stakes. That is when mistakes happen. That is when miscalculations occur. And that is when situations can spiral beyond what anyone intended. That is why the world is watching closely, not just what has happened, but what happens next. Because the next move will not just respond to the current situation, it will shape the future of it. And in that future, the options now being quietly considered may become the actions that define the next phase. Whether those actions bring stability or further tension remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the moment something crosses a line in a contested space, the game changes. And once the game changes, every player must adapt. Because standing still is no longer an option, and adapting too slowly can be just as dangerous as acting too quickly. That is the reality now facing everyone involved. A reality where caution and calculation must coexist, where strength must be balanced with restraint, where every move must be considered not just for its immediate effect, but for how it will influence the next move and the one after that. Because in the end, the outcome will not be determined by a single action, but by the sequence of actions that follow. And that sequence is only just beginning.